The KindlED Podcast is brought to you by Prenda. Prenda can help you start and run an amazing microschool. For more information, go to prenda.com.
A child's uniqueness is not something to be ignored. It is something to cultivate, because we know over and over again from our research, a person's individuality is the greatest source of their fulfillment, but also their highest contribution to society. Imagine your child coming out of an environment prepared, but also confident and happy and able to contribute to society.
Hi, and welcome to the KindlED Podcast, where we dig into the art and science behind kindling the motivation, curiosity, and mental well-being of the young humans in our lives.
Together, we'll discover practical tools and strategies you can use to help kids unlock their full potential and become the strongest version of their future selves.
Hi, and welcome to the KindlED Podcast. Adriane, it's good to see you today. How's it going?
Good. It's so great to see you too, Katie. How are you doing today?
Super good. What's going on at your house?
We have been doing some parent-teacher conferences with my middle schooler, and I get to meet with all of his teachers individually. They've done it different ways in the past. It's like you show up and you just kind of get like a little snippets of time. Last year, I sat down with all of them at a table, and that was really interesting because, my student isn't the most model student as far as behavior goes, but with some teachers he is and some teachers he's not, and it's all about relationship, which really with any child, right? And so I went in this time, we actually got 20 minutes with each teacher, and I sat down, brand new teacher. She actually hasn't even finished her degree yet. In Arizona, you can teach without an education degree, but she is getting it, and she will complete it at the end of this year. So anyway, she's like, I'm a new teacher, and she's older, she has children. And she said, I'm completing my degree this year. And this school kept telling me mastery base, like we're doing mastery base. However, they're doing it in the system. It is a charter school. There are certain things that they have to follow. And it's a hybrid school. Do you know what a hybrid school is?
Tell me.
It is basically part-time in-person instruction and part-time virtual learning. And so brand new teacher, she's going to school right now, and it's interesting. She's going to school and has never heard the concept of mastery-based learning, which she thought was kind of funny too. And so she told me, because she sat down and just was showing us all these very, very creative ways that she is making it mastery-based within this system that is not meant, to be individualized for the student. And so I asked her, I was like, so how did you come up with this? And she looks at me and said, TikTok.
Perfect.
She's in school, Katie. She's in school to become a teacher, and she's
I
learning
love it.
how to individualize learning on TikTok, which I thought was pretty awesome.
That actually doesn't make me mad because we're on TikTok. And if someone that was in teaching school found our content and figured out how they could empower kids with mastery-based learning and inquiry-based learning, more power to them, right? It'll catch on in teachers' colleges. It'll get there.
It's pretty amazing though, because she basically has them take this quick quiz just to see where they are, they have no idea what they're going to be learning, like a new topic, and just to see what they already know so that they can have a measure. As soon as we sat down, she asked him, she said, what do you think you got in the pretest? And he's like, like a 60%. And she said, okay, what do you think you got after we learned the content? And he was like, probably like an 80%. And she wrote it down on a sticky and she slid it across the table. His face was amazing because he started at 38% and he ended up after he learned it, and they were collaborating and doing projects and things like this based or around the topic, he had a 90%, and his face was like, whoa, look how much so even just seeing his confidence of look how much I learned versus if he would just take that test and fail it, I'm stupid, let's just move on, because that's kind of how it was when he was in just a traditional learning environment. So it's really, I'm just amazed at these teachers and educators that are finding ways to truly personalize learning, which leads us to who we're kind of talking to today. He's done a lot of research on average and what that means. So Katie, can you tell us who we're talking to today?
Yes, I definitely can. Todd Rose is the co-founder and CEO of Populace, a think tank committed to a positive sum world where all people have the opportunity to live fulfilling lives in a thriving society. Prior to Populace, Dr. Rose was a professor at Harvard University, where he served as the faculty director at the Mind, Brain, and Education program, as well as led the laboratory for the Science of Individuality. Todd is the author of 3 best-selling books, The End of Average, Dark Horse, and Collective Illusions. He lives in Burlington, Massachusetts. We're so excited to talk to Dr. Todd Rose today. Todd Rose, welcome to the KindlED Podcast. We're so excited to have you today.
Excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about you and your background and how you came to do the work that you're doing today, and kind of give us a little insight into how that might relate to education.
Sure. Okay, so I would first ask like how far back you want me to go, but I'll give you the professional stuff and then we can see how far you want to go. But my original work research has been I was a professor for over a decade. I led the Mind Brain Education program at Harvard. My obsession has been around this idea of the science of individuality, which is related to education, as we'll see, but not specific to it, which is for most of our history, especially the last 100, 200 years, we've basically just studied groups and averages. And so my work has been part of the new field that gets away from that and studies individuals on their own terms, and same methodologies leading to like personalized medicine, nutrition, education. So I'm obsessed about that. And I'm particularly obsessed about the way we structure learning environments, because I feel like this is the place where either we amplify individuality and potential or we absolutely just squash it. And I think, it's not just about batch processing kids to prepare them for pre-existing jobs. It's quite literally the cultivation of an entire generation of potential and fulfillment.
Yeah, I love that framing. Take us a little further back to some of your own personal history and relationships with growing up and being labeled.
Sure. I have a mixed track record in education. I guess that'd be fair. So I like to lead with, at some point I was reasonably smart. I grew up though, like school did not work. I grew up in rural America. In the place I was at, everything was about conformity, and that was just not going to work for me. But I also am just like a curious person, and my personality did not fit very well with this sit down, shut up, like you're going to learn what we tell you when we tell you. And it culminated where I like to say I dropped out of high school, but really they just kicked me out. It just feels better. Like I had some control. We mutually agreed that I would leave with a 0.9 GPA, which I say that because I actually think you have to work really hard to do that poorly. Like I didn't even get socially promoted. Right. And it was an interesting sort of rock bottom, because shortly thereafter, my girlfriend at the time found out she was pregnant. We ended up having 2 kids by the time we were 21. Like I had like a string of minimum wage jobs. It was bad. We were on welfare. And that was sort of the time when I realized education was going to play a much more positive role in my life. I was really fortunate. My dad was the first high school graduate in our family, and decided, he was a mechanic, decided when I was in middle school to go to college at night. And he became a mechanical engineer, and he just retired. He's one of the highest achieving. He designed airbags, and he's invented so many things that have saved so many people's lives. And so I watched education change our lives and life circumstances, and realized, okay, well, I mean, maybe that, right? Which was funny given my past record. So I took the GED. I enrolled at Weber State University, open enrollment school in Ogden, Utah. And we had just enough money that my family had cobbled together that I could get through 1 year. And if I couldn't do well enough to get some kind of scholarship, that was going to be it. And I have to say, just for context, this is no kidding. I mean, the last job I had before I did that, it was just almost out of desperation. My job was, I was a home health care aide who traveled around and gave people enemas. That was my job. So I knew what I didn't want, and I knew that I had to do right by my kids, and but I didn't know where I was going. I just knew something had to change. And I got to Weber State, and again, out of desperation, I knew that if I did the same things I'd done, tried learning the same way that I'd tried before, it wasn't going to work. That was my first encounter with, well, maybe I need to know more about myself and make choices there. I actually thought it was because something was wrong with me, and I just had to get workarounds. Do you know what I mean? Like everybody else could succeed the standardized way, for sort of dumb people like me. We got to do extra stuff. This is the thing that makes me so angry about education. So a kid goes into a standardized experience that has no respect for their individuality. And if they gut through it, we call that success, right? Like it's amplifying nobody, but they gut through it. So I keep failing. Why wouldn't I assume that it's me? Like what kid's going to be like, the system is structured wrong, right? Like, so you internalize a view of yourself that will,
I'm bad. I'm not good. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. And it's like, you're just not worthy. You're not smart. And then that's going to affect the choices you make the rest of your life. You are going to rule out opportunities because you don't believe you are capable. It makes me angry when we talk about things like personalized learning and these new models of education. We can sometimes get caught up in the mechanics of it as if that's the no. This is about like what we owe our children. Like these institutions have the ability to uplift or just crush. And so it's more at stake than just whether we get higher test scores. So back for me, I'm making my way through it. I had some good experiences. I'm learning that like context really matters. I kind of knew the classes that were working for me. I was doing the best I could. And I'll tell you, there's one defining moment that completely changes my life. And I was sitting in a history class in a big auditorium. I couldn't get out of it. That's not a good environment for me to learn, but I couldn't get out of it. It was just it. And I'm sitting next to my buddy Steve, and the class ends, and I'm like, this is so boring. Like, this is so bad. And he says, oh, this is nothing compared to what he got himself into in honors program. And I was like, I don't know what honors is. Like, I thought it was just more work or whatever. And he's like, no, you got it wrong. It's so much worse than that. He said, there aren't lectures. There's just like these small groups of no more than 12 students. So you can't skip because everybody knows your name. Okay. He's like, we don't take tests. We just write essays and come up with ideas. And he goes, I don't even think there are right answers. We just debate all the time. And I'm like, whoa. I'd never heard of anything like that, right? I literally took my bags, skipped my next class, went right to the honors program, went in, and the secretary, a woman named Marilyn Diamond, who's one of the most important people ever to me. I said, I want to be in the honors program. And she says, okay, like, let's see if I can get you in and talk to the director. So they just let me in. They're excited because it's an open enrollment school. They're trying to beef up this special program they've got. So the director's really excited. So come sit in front of me. I sit down in front of his desk. And he's like, okay, I'm excited. You want to be in the honors program? Just a few questions. What's your high school GPA? And I said, 0.9. And this is no kidding. He actually said, what 0.9? like I left off kind of the most important piece. And then I am just like mortified where I'm like 0.9. And he's like, he was really nice about it. He wasn't mean. He just was like, you can't be in the honors program. Like, and I just rushed there because it sounded amazing. And now I'm sitting there just like wishing I could crawl under a rock, right? Like, this is just the worst. So I'm just grabbing my stuff. I apologize. I shake his hand. Sorry for wasting your time. And I just want to get out. And as I'm leaving the office, Marilyn Diamond's desk is just right outside the door. And as I'm walking out, she reached out and grabbed my arm. And she said, listen, I overheard the conversation. If you want this, don't take no for an answer. And I was like, I didn't know you could, right? So in my mind, the authority was the authority. Like, there was no wiggle room. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she's just sit here on the couch and don't leave until he lets you in. So I sat there for at least 3 hours as he came in and out. He went and taught a class, came back, and he kept saying, what are you doing? You know, like, I'm like, I want to be in an honors program. And he's like, you can't. So finally, what felt like the entire day, but it was just a few hours, he pokes his head out. And he says, come in. And he sat me and he said, look, why do you want to be in the honors program? Because on paper, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. And so I explained to him, like, yeah, despite failing algebra 3 times in high school and not doing very well, like, I know it looks like it should be this linear thing, but I know enough about myself now, about the environments where I think I do well. and where I don't. And this seems like perfect. And he said, okay, I can't let you in permanently, but I'll let you in provisionally. Pick a class. And if you do well, I'll let you pick another class and we'll go from there. So this was like, I thought the most important decision of my life. I went through the catalog, looked at every class they offered, and I picked Plagues of the Modern Era because I was like, well, that scares the heck out of me. Like, like this should keep my attention. And it was everything I ever imagined. And I just thrived. And flash forward, I graduated with a 397 GPA in psychology, pre-med, on my way to Harvard for my doctorate, but also as the honor student of the year. And I say that for two reasons. One is it absolutely taught me the importance of individuality and good fit. It is about fit between the individual and their learning environment. And there's just no two ways about that. How can the same kid fail remedial math and succeed in honors, right? If not for it's contextualized, it's about fit. But second, and I never want to lose sight of this is like the story of my life. Like I've worked really hard to get where I am, and I'm proud of that effort I put in. None of it would have mattered without Marilyn Diamond. None of it. And here's what's funny about Marilyn Diamond. I was just back at Weber State a few years ago to get an award for alum of the year kind of thing, like, and she was retiring that same time. And I thought, what a great opportunity to tell some version of this story while she's in the audience. So I tell it more or less like I told you. The dean gets excited. He's like, Marilyn, why don't you come up? They all applaud for her. She gets to the microphone. She gives me a hug. And she gets to the microphone. She says, well, look, I'm kind of embarrassed. She said, Todd, I don't remember this. And I thought she was saying I was lying, right? And I'm like, no, it happened. She's like, no, I know, I just don't remember it. And for me, I remember it as this most important event of my life up to that time. And what turns out is everyone had a Marilyn story. This was how she was. And I never forgot this because it was so life-changing for me, but it was minimal effort for her from her own mission. And I think this is how it works, right? Like really getting the most out of our potential is not a solo exercise. And sometimes we think that it requires massive amounts of our investment in other people to truly help them when it's not really true, right? Showing up in these small moments can make all the difference in the world.
Wow, so much to unpack there. As you're talking, my brain was going in all many different directions. I was thinking though about like the motivation for it to even matter to you is like once there was skin in the game and you were like, I don't want to keep giving enemas and and I have a family. And so there's accountability there too. It's like, okay, I have skin in the game, but you still were like, this isn't working for me. How can I get it to work for me? I mean, that's incredible that she was there and I can't believe like she can't even remember that. And she just was probably just doing her thing. Like you go and, and probably communicates that with a lot of people. But then a few things that you said that I found that really resonated with me. So conformity totally worked for me. I loved the school system. It was a reprieve from, not the best what was happening at home, and I performed really well. However, even instead of thinking I was a bad kid or something was wrong with me, I was obsessed with the grades and obsessed with performing well. So, it was kind of the opposite. But then I had a child who conformity does not work for him at all. And every time I got a call from that school in kindergarten, I remember feeling like I was the one getting in trouble. And then he would come home and I remember these conversations I was having with him. You have to do better. Like you have to care. And because it was about me in that moment, it wasn't even about him. And then year after year. So we ended up finding Prenda when he was middle of fourth grade. So we went 5.5 years before we finally left that system. And I got calls constantly. And I mean, I do have to say, he had quite a few teachers that were really good and could see like there was something more in him. But that fourth grade year, I remember sitting in the principal's office, going over his 504 plan, sitting with an OT and with the teacher and the assistant principal. And the occupational therapist was like, look at the way his brain works. This is incredible. He's able to do these things I've never seen a child be able to do in the 20 years I've been doing this work. And the teacher's like, he's disruptive. He's not, like just was focusing so much on the behavior. Like, I don't care about what his brain can do. But I get it. I can give her a little bit of grace because she had 36 students. And he's like equates about 20 himself, his behaviors were very big. And so, but what's incredible is, he did Prenda for a little while and then he wanted, more friends and more of like a regular environment, but the traditional system just, does not work for him. We found this school and it's a hybrid. I talked about this in our intro. And even though they're in the system and they're in a charter, they are so creative and innovative in how they can do mastery-based learning. And when he gets in trouble, he comes home, he's like, Mom, he's like, I was behaving not in the greatest way. Like he just gets really big and lots of, behaviors. He's like, the principal walks around the campus with me. We went and pulled weeds together. And he was like asking me how I felt. He's like, in my other school, like I had to go and stand against the wall and be shamed pretty much for having to move my body. So much of your story really resonates with me. And there's so many kids out there that do start to develop this very limiting belief system at such a young age. These 5 and 6-year-olds already thinking they're a bad kid because they can't sit still or because they can't, they're doing timed math tests in, kindergarten and first grade. And these kids can't keep up. They're just learning how to write their numbers. So much of what you say, I think is so important that we look at what we're doing in the system, right?
Well, that's the thing. And we can talk more about some of my work in the science because it'll be relevant, but just, we can have respect for like public education and our ability to commit to educating the masses is one of the greatest accomplishments probably of human history, right? Off of the high school movement where it really peaks. No one had ever done that. And back then, with our technologies and our resources, you chose between giving a standardized experience to everyone or a bespoke experience to a privileged few. And so if we were having this conversation back then, I would have been the biggest advocate for standardized education because I want everyone to get something rather than a few to get everything. What we have to recognize, though, and as parents and as teachers and just the general public, is that we tend to think because we went through something, it must be the way it should be done and that it's the right way. When in reality, our technologies, our understanding of how learning happens, our appreciation for human uniqueness, and even our economy and what it needs and values has so fundamentally changed that we don't have to live with the constraints of the past. Like, and it won't be good enough to say we're abandoning that system wholesale for another one size fits all model, right? The pluralism, the ability to create experiences that are responsive to each individual and yet allow them to achieve common things, is what's special about the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, in your book, you call it the efficiency model, that like the faster you learn, the smarter you are, and the slower you go, like that's lack of intelligence. Where did that idea come from? Give us the history of kind of like, where did this idea that there is an average, a perfect, like a thing that we should all be attaining to, like how did that happen to society?
Yeah. Well, that's what's funny is like in the book, at the end of average, that's why I was like, people don't realize that we're living in a society that believes there's such a thing as an average person. And in fact, most people hear that and go, well, right, oh, there has to be, obviously, right? And you almost imagine a bell curve and there's like something in the middle. And first of all, it turns out that's not true. And we can get to that. But I thought before we show that scientifically, I thought we should probably explain, how did we get here? How did we ever think that this would be true? And it turns out it's just this arc of, 1835, this Belgian astronomer, Adolf Quetelet. Like, seriously, in astronomy, when your biggest problem is that, let's say we're all trying to measure the same thing, and we're in different locations. Well, look, you're going to measure it slightly different than I am. The instrument can be different, just human error. And the biggest problem they had in astronomy was which of these measurements is true. And it turns out, as long as they're just sort of random errors, if you just average all of the measurements, the average is way closer to the truth. And that is true. Okay, so KindlED, he's running this observatory in Belgium. And he knows how to do that. It's the law of errors. And at the same time, it's the rise of the first big data where we started doing demographic surveys, because it was also like revolution and we're getting rid of kings and we got, okay, well, how does someone govern? So he's getting a lot of big data for the first time. And every time he plots it, he sees this bell curve. And he's like, well, wait a minute. If the average in astronomy is what's true, what if like the average of the human being stuff, what if that's actually what God meant? That's his view. What if it's like actually the truth and the rest of it's just kind of error, right? So he coins the term the average person. And people were like, this is so dumb at first, like really, really mocked him. But it took off because of insurance. So it turns out I don't need for insurance. I'm just amortizing risk across everybody. So knowing averages was really helpful. And now as a person, whether it's life insurance or I want to insure a shipment as an entrepreneur, this was valuable to me. And so it starts to just seep into society. And that's the first one. Now, KindlED thought averages were perfection. He loved them. He thought the whole goal of society was to shave off the edges, get everyone to the average. He didn't think being above average was better. He called them both sides of the curve monstrosities. So yeah, he wanted everyone to be average. The second guy you got to know about, though, and KindlED was a decent guy. He just was genuinely trying to improve society. But then this guy who was guy named Francis Galton, he was truly a bad guy. So he's in England and he reads KindlED. And he's like, this is amazing. Just one problem. Averages aren't good. It's above average that you want to be, because he was an aristocrat. And he was watching it in his time in like the 1860s and stuff, a lot of working class people wanting to be able to vote, wanted to participate. And he was like, this is bad. And his cousin was Charles Darwin. And so you get evolution comes on the scene. He's like, well, but what about these? So he's trying to find ways to start selecting the best from the rest. He actually is the father of eugenics. That would be about, but he needs a tool. How do I know who's best? And he knew it was people like him. So what's really funny is he invents a bunch of mathematics off of KindlED stuff that we still use today. So he invented the idea of percentiles, because if the curve isn't just error, I've got to be able to measure how far away from the curve. So he contributed to correlation, regression, all these things we use, all in the name of like, how do we find the smartest people and then get the dumb people to not breathe, really. So these ideas of average and rank, is the way he thought about it, get pulled into America in this age of standardization that most people don't know about. This is the last person I'll tell you. This is probably too wonky, but there's an approach called the efficiency movement that started by Frederick Taylor. This guy decides, wait a minute, yeah, if we standardized everything, we could be more efficient, which is true. You can. He was obsessed with the ideas, puts them into practice, but he puts them into practice at work. So he completely changes how businesses are run. He invents the term manager. Like he says, why are employees having a say in what they do? This doesn't make any sense. So anyway, basically the drudgery of work that most people experience is directly thanks to this guy, right? Frederick Taylor. And then it just seeps. So the last step of this and how we got to where we are today, it seeps into education, not surprisingly, right? If work is standardized and factorized, then how do you prepare people for that standardized environment? So we deploy the same ideas of standardization and rank and selection. And the guy that does the most for that is Edward Thorndike, the father of educational psychology. Ironically, this is a guy who's a eugenicist as well, who didn't believe everyone should go to school. They weren't smart enough. So he's the one that comes up with, he realizes that what it meant to be smart. This is the longest answer to your question ever, probably. But your question of how did we get to this idea of like fast equals smart and slow equals dumb? So Thorndike believed that your brain had a speed to it, and smart was just how fast you could form memories. And so he was like, well, obviously fast is smart and slow is dumb. So we actually still follow this in a standardized education system when we come up with, for example, how long we should give you to take a standardized test. Things like the SAT. This is how long it takes the average person to finish, under the assumption that if you're slower than that, you're too stupid to make use of the time. And in fact, when we ask for more time, it's considered cheating, or you need to have a disability to get it. And so we locked that in. And now we have so much research that shows it was complete garbage. Like, actually, speed and ability have nothing in common, nothing. And once you realize that, then you realize fixed time learning may be the greatest destroyer of talent and potential that you could have ever devised. My good friend Sal Khan, right? He sees this in spades in the self-paced learning environments he has, where it's like someone will look like they don't understand it and then just pop, right? And you're like, wow, if we would have stopped their learning, 2 days earlier, they would look like the worst performing kid in the class.
Or if we interject right there and shame them or make them feel like they're not winning, we don't have to do anything because they'll quit on their own.
That's right. And one of my intellectual idols would be Benjamin Bloom, who's the father of mastery learning, and what he does and just proves. I still think it's the most underappreciated educational research out there. So he basically says, well, if we just stop for a second and think, what would be like literally the best education you could have? And he's like, wouldn't it be like a one-to-one tutor that knew you really well and like knew the material and could respond? And he's like, look, Alexander the Great had, he had Aristotle, right? Like, this is, not a bad tutor, right? And so he says, well, let's just see, right? Like, because he was pushing back against this standardized model that said there's a bell curve of talent, and some kids are just innately smart and some kids aren't. So he does this random assignment, like not with just like everyday kids, and puts one group in this same material in the normal classroom, fixed time, right? One to many, and other kids in self-paced, same total amount of time, by the way, just self-paced in this one, and with tutor. And what he finds is it becomes what's called the 2 sigma challenge, which is it was so overwhelmingly better in the tutoring condition that the typical kid was performing in the 98th percentile of the standardized group. Like it is just like, and what he takes away from it is what one kid can do academically, most any kid could do under highly favorable conditions. And so he gets excited, but then he's like, well, wait a minute, what would it mean to give everybody that kind of personalized learning? He gets his economist friends at the University of Chicago to run the numbers, and it's something like 40 times whatever any country's ever spent on education at the time. So he's like, well, that's just not possible. So he instead invents mastery learning, which is how could we get most of this effect in a classroom environment, right? And it is, most of the time in science, ideas die because they get falsified, because they just don't work, right? This might be the only example that I know of where it went away, not because it was not true, but because the government became disinterested in it. It was that nation at risk. It was all these things where we're like, uh-oh, the Russians are getting ahead of us. We just got to get more engineers and more da-da-da. And they just stopped caring about the cultivation of kids. And then we went obsessive on these high stakes tests and all these things. And in part because we still didn't really have the technology to do that in a very like cost effective way. But we do now. And there may be the least controversial statement I'll probably say all day today is that mastery based learning is so ridiculously superior to anything else that it's almost immoral that we don't provide that for every single kid in this country, especially when we can do it at it doesn't cost more. than what we're spending right now. And so I feel like, in my work on the science of individuality, the places that made the change fastest when they realized there's no such thing as an average person were in medicine, where there's a moral imperative, right? But how is the cultivation of a child's personality and potential any less moral as an imperative? We compel parents to send their kids to school. And you know what, John Dewey, who no one would think is center right? He was the most progressive educational philosopher at the time, wrote a book. I probably will butcher the name. I think it was Individuality in Education. But he said, the only justification for compulsory education in a democracy is the full development of a child's individuality. Anything else, you can't. How do you justify having the government force parents to drop kids off at this school, like Israel, unless you are committed to the development of their individuality?
Wow, that's really powerful.
Very powerful. Again, my brain's going in all the different directions. So much of what you say resonate because my second child is getting a one-to-one education thanks to, we have ESA here in Arizona. And so he has a private tutor and it's incredible. The education, just how rich the education he's getting. He doesn't do worksheets. I mean, they just read this really incredible like literature, and he loves diving into history. I think he does like 4 or 5 different histories and sciences, and but he has this one-to-one education. My mind goes, though, that's not available to every kid. So what you're saying is then, okay, we have mastery base. Let's do this so that we can provide that to more kids. So if average does not exist, then how do we move forward? Like, what's next for humanity? And I guess another question I have is like, why do we keep doing things the way we're doing if the research is so sticking clear?
That one's easy, right? Like, our brains care about stability and predictability, not flourishing. The good news is that with respect to education, the pandemic took away status quo. And this is why we'll talk about later. The private opinion research we have on where Americans really are and parents is pretty shocking. So we need to talk about that. But let me tell you, when I say, so what do you do and say there's no average? Let me give you an example. Because sometimes when people hear it, you're like, come on, like there has to be an average, maybe exaggerating. Let me give you an example outside of education and show you why it matters and what we do instead. So my colleagues in Israel applied this same science of individuality to the study of nutrition, and in particular the metabolic problems, right? So metabolic disorders is like, it's basically the biggest burden on our healthcare system: diabetes, prediabetes, these kind of things. So the way you normally deal with this is you use the glycemic index, right? Which is supposed to tell you, right, this food elevates your blood sugar this much. Okay, glycemic index is about averages. This is what happens on average. Well, they're assuming then it must work for most people. So they asked a simple question: how many people, they studied hundreds of thousands of individuals, how many people actually respond the way the glycemic index says they should? So far, 0. Not a single person.
0. I really?
Because and I can, that's one example. I can give you so many, it's comical. But here's the good news. Okay, you're like, well, wait a minute. If nobody responds that way, well, first of all, it seems like a really stupid thing to force people to do. But here's what's cool. And this is what's possible once we get our head out of the age of standardization, out of this idea that the only way to scale is by creating one size fits all, right? Our technologies make that an irrelevant thing now. So here's what they did. They were able to use technology, a basic app. They are able to create, with machine learning and some AI, individual level predictions of how I will respond based on blood work, gut biome, all this stuff. So I did it, right? Because in my family, by the way, I was always worried about diabetes because it just runs in my family. And I went to a nutritionist early in my adult life, and they told me, oh, you need to eat grapefruit. Because actually, on average, grapefruit is pretty remarkable as a stabilizer for blood sugar, on average. So I had been eating half a grapefruit for breakfast every morning for most of my adult life. So I do this. I'm just intrigued by it, by the science, get my results back. And for me, grapefruit is the single worst food I can possibly eat. It actually spikes my blood sugar more than chocolate cake.
Wow. So does that mean that you should then replace your everyday meal with chocolate cake?
With chocolate cake, right? I like that. I like how you think. My friend that did it, completely opposite, right? But what was amazing is it looks like chaos. If the average doesn't work, what are we indexing against? Well, we don't have to. So with our technologies, we were able to meet you exactly where you are and give you real-time recommendations about how this food will affect you, even if it affects nobody else the same way. And in that way, we can actually get population level optimal health, one person at a time. Whereas if you rely on average, you are guaranteeing diabetes, guaranteeing it to people. Meanwhile, they're doing it because their insurance company says you have to. You're doing all this stuff. This is what I mean when not only is there no average, but the opposite of that is not chaos. It is we can actually scale population level solutions this way. And that's the science that I've been a part of. That's in nutrition, that's in medicine. And by the way, everybody that's listening to this, you're already past averages. Because if I told you, God forbid you got cancer, and I said you could choose between gold standard average based treatment, or you can have personalized treatment, molecular fingerprinting, customized response to you. Which one are you choosing? And you know the answer. You know it because there's something inside of you that appreciates that your distinctiveness actually matters. It's not error, right? It's not something to ignore. It is valuable. So that's true in nutrition. That's true in medicine. It is absolutely true in education. A child's uniqueness is not something to be ignored. It's not something to put on a bell curve and call it error or select off of it. It is something to cultivate because we know over and over again from our research, a person's individuality is the greatest source of their fulfillment, but also their highest contribution to society. And so when I think about individualized, personalized kinds of learning environments, yes, they consistently do better academically, but I don't actually care. We're missing the point. I'm talking about imagine your child coming out of an environment prepared, but also confident and happy and able to contribute to society. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? And what frustrates me when we talk about the distinction between these kinds of models is we often revert to allowing us to be judged by the incumbent system's metrics, which, if you think about it, are actually bell curve tests most of the time. Like, don't do it. Like that those are garbage assessments. Like, you know what I mean? Like, don't let the fight be had at that level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of parents feel like there's a trade-off between strong academics and like mental well-being and happiness. And when they look at the average and where what they believe to be the only path forward to success for their child, they think I have to choose this average path, even if it's mediocre, it's safer, right? And what they don't realize is that we've got the psychology of this all switched up in traditional schools. In Prenda, we follow something called self-determination theory.
Autonomy,
Mhm.
connectedness, competency. These basic psychological needs that everybody has, and we often think that these things are somehow at odds. They're not. They're not. You can build deeply autonomy promoting environments that are even more connected and that allow kids to consistently master things and grow and improve.
Yes, and we see that in our data. We talking about scaling these ideas. We've helped over 1,000 people start these really small schools, and we watch all of the data, and we care deeply about. We call it the child's empowerment score, where it's like the kid is telling us, "Are you feeling in control? Do you feel like the pacing is right for you? Do you feel like you have a purpose in learning?" We're tracking their internal locus of control and things like this, and caring more about that than their math score. When you care about that, the math score goes up.
Let's punch down on this for just a second. And I want to put this in a bigger context and why this is so important. Okay. So at Populace, my think tank, we do what's called private opinion research. So, and no one's telling the truth about their views right now. It's just like ridiculous. And so we can get around all those distorting effects. And we've been studying a lot of things. We study what you want for the country, what do you want out of life, what do you want out of education, what do you want in criminal justice, these kind of things to try to understand what do people want, because that's what the institution should do, not the other way around. You are not a cog in the institution. In democracies, institutions should serve people. And so, but you got to know what they want. Well, here's the overarching theme in America today is it is the end of compliance culture. This idea of paternalism that came from Frederick Taylor and the scientific management, which is there's a few smart people who get to make the decisions for everybody else. That is so fundamentally un-American at its core. That is literally a country born out of self-determination and the commitment to individuals being able to live lives they want to live. We took a left turn in Albuquerque there. Like we went the wrong way down this path where we were promised more material goods through efficiency if we gave up any hope of self-determination. Now, they gave it that. We did. We got it. And now we're sick of it. And so the thing is if you see this over and over again, people want control of their lives back. They want it back. And you're seeing that in education when, man, I remember in Virginia when Terry McAuliffe put the teachers union head on stage at the very end and said, parents shouldn't have more of a say. I'm like, we have a lot of private opinion data that says even left-leaning parents aren't saying it out loud right now, but privately, they absolutely want more of a say. And so it's like this shift, this end of compliance culture, we're also seeing people are deeply resentful of it. They hate that people are controlling them. The reason I say that is that resentment around being controlled can go one of two ways. You're seeing it manifest in some terribly destructive ways right now where you get so mad, just burn it down, that kind of thing, right? And that's what will happen if we don't make this more constructive. So when people listening right now think about something like a scientific theory of human flourishing, like self-determination theory, and realizing it's more than this academic concept, it is literally the gift to your child of the thing that was robbed from you. Imagine a child developing with that innate sense that they are in charge of their lives and that their effects matter in the world. There is no greater gift that you could give a kid. And I would trade every academic metric there is for a kid that actually has this, because you can learn anything now. You can do anything. So realize what's really at stake there and don't just default to the way it's been done, because this is our way out. This is how you make the end of compliance culture constructive, is that it's channeled into self-determination.
I love that. We touched on this, but I want to dig into it a little bit more. The concept of jaggedness. And can you just kind of round that? We've touched on it, but just like define it for us. And
like you might ask, like, well, so why is no one average? Right? Like, and I'll give you the story, and I did it in End of Average, but I think it's worth repeating. The first time we ever figured out there's no such thing as an average person, and it was actually the United States Air Force. Weirdly, right? So the way you design a cockpit for a fighter jet. How do I create one cockpit that fits as many pilots as possible? So someone had thought, well, you know what you do is you take the average of body dimensions of like height, weight, chest circumference, and then just build a cockpit for that. And they thought, well, it won't fit everyone, but it'll fit most people. And when we went to jet-powered aviation, they knew there was a problem. Someone thought, well, maybe we've gotten bigger, so we need a better average. So they sent this guy, Gilbert Daniels, who I got to know. He just passed away, but he was just out of college. His job was literally to go around to thousands and thousands of pilots and measure them on a bunch of dimensions of size. Because he's the only guy doing it, he's starting to see this thing where he's like, man, people are pretty variable. And so he's like, I wonder how many people are actually average like this says. So he's like, let's just take the 5 dimensions of size, the top 5, height, weight. How many people are average of these pilots who are picked because they can fit in the cockpit, mind you? He tallies the numbers, and just like our nutrition friends, figures out 0. Like none of these white male pilots who are picked because they fit in the cockpit were actually average on any of these dimensions of size. So he's like, wait, I think we got the problem wrong. And so off of that research comes the field of ergonomics and human factors, where it's like, maybe it's about designing flexibility to fit, right? Turns out the fighter jets didn't have adjustable seats at all, didn't have any movement at all. And they implement very simple solutions. The military actually banned the use of averages in design. You cannot design on average in the military, even though in education, we literally incentivize designing on average right now. And so why they weren't, what he did is he plotted it. It's really cool. It was declassified research right before I wrote my book, so I was able to show it in there. He plots it and he shows, if you just take 10 dimensions of size, in our minds, we kind of think of size as like big, medium, small, as if it's just miniaturized versions of the same thing. But he's like, if you think about it, it's not really true. Like the tallest person you know isn't necessarily the heaviest person you know, right? And so what he found was that basically, if you said height, that's one dimension, and there would be an average, and that average would be meaningful. But size is multiple dimensions. And it turns out those dimensions don't correlate with each other like you think they do. So every single person is on the high end on some dimensions, in the middle on others, and on the low on others. Everybody. So when you plot it and design it, it creates this sort of jagged profile. Like everybody has that. And that turns out to be true not just in body size. It's true of IQ, which I don't really believe in, but whatever, IQ scores, character, like you name it. Human beings have multiple dimensions, and those dimensions don't correlate like you think. So if you start with that, you realize, well, then the average could never represent anybody. It's flawed from the beginning. And so that's the core of that. And it's like every student does. I guarantee you, when you look at this on any kind of performance, this is what you're always going to see. So when we collapse performance into a single score, you erase all the information that's truly valuable.
Then what do you think about the phrase developmentally appropriate?
I think it is code for this is a really bad idea. And because think about it, all that is a fancy way of saying, what does the average kid at this age know or can do? Same problem applies, right? And we know this. When you look at development, that is actually my background. It's tons of individuality in how kids develop, and the rate, the pace, but also the way things sequence and integrate. And so it really makes no sense. And it drives me nuts. What's funny about, like, say, age appropriate, development appropriate, or grade level kinds of things, first of all, no one knows what that means. There's a bunch of different measures of it. They don't actually agree because it's not a thing. And so if you're going to say, what does the average kid in third grade know about math? And if you don't know that, you're behind. It's like, it's not true. Now, by the way, are there telltale signs when some kid is genuinely in trouble? Yeah, right? But being off by like 10 percentage points from the average of a representative sample of third graders is decidedly not that, right? And here's the problem with that. I'll give you an example specifically to reading. My mentor, Kurt Fisher, he was one of the pioneers of the Science of Individuality, and he applied this individual level modeling to how kids learn to read at an early age. And there was one theory. It was like how you build from sight, sound, integration, and single word reading. And all of the education stuff was built around this theory. What he found was that there were actually 3 stable pathways to reading. One was the average pathway, but it only covered about 30% of the kids. The other one was different, but it led to the same kind of outcomes, good outcomes. The third was actually a dead end. It was bad. So the way you knew if a kid was in trouble was not how they were doing compared to the average. It was which pathway were they on. And the sad part was that so many times, if we're only teaching on this one average pathway, the kid only has a couple of options. You're ahead, you're on track, or you're behind. And so kids get behind, and what do? We double down on remediation, assuming there's one pathway. And when in reality, they were pursuing a completely different pathway, which was every bit as viable, and you couldn't see it. And I believe we've actually created reading disorders because of our inability to recognize how reading really happens. And this is true for every academic subject. So one of the telltale signs that I look at when I'm like, this is not a good environment, is when you are locked into one size fits all, there's one right way to do everything, and there's no flexibility embedded in any learning material or any sequencing of learning outcomes.
Where I use the phrase developmentally appropriate whenever a parent is treating like a 2 or a 3-year-old as if they're an adult, I'm like, well, they should be throwing a toy right now. They should be yelling and screaming. So do you agree that there is some room for that phrase?
Yeah, I think if you are, because that's a flipped around version, right? It's not an ideal. It is actually saying there's a range of behavior that is appropriate to the development of this kid, right? So, and that makes tons of sense. And when you look at things like Piagetian kind of development, where you will see qualitative changes roughly in certain age ranges, which is largely about biological maturation meeting, environment. As long as what we're doing is saying, don't force a kid into an expectation of certain kinds of behavior that is just so wildly inappropriate to the range of like that kid should not be expected to be like an adult. They do not have the cognitive or neurological facilities to do that. And you were expecting something that they cannot do, then I think that's a perfect use of it. When we flip it around and make it an ideal and a narrow, specific, literally like this thing is what all kids should do in third grade, we've bastardized that to the point where it doesn't mean what we think it means.
Yeah, that's a really important differentiation because we coach a lot of parents and educators on having those expectations and in like a framing of like let's be overly compassionate here and realize that this behavior, and you talk a lot about this context. In End of Average, you talk about how you were labeled as aggressive, right? It's like, wow. Or maybe you were just your story goes, I mean, you can tell it better than I can probably, but you were being bullied essentially, and you were creating coping mechanisms that seemed aggressive to the adults that were observing you, and that really changed your life trajectory and your perception of yourself. When really, if someone had been able to look at that situation and say, what a logical and appropriate response to that context.
And I think that's right. The compassion aspect of like, look, parents do this all the time, right? You've got a young kid, a toddler, and you've been taking them out all day, you've been shopping yourself, and they didn't get their nap. You are more compassionate about behavior than you would be if in a different context you're like, no, they have their nap. This is just unacceptable behavior because there's certain things out. So same is true when we expect certain behaviors that are just developmentally inappropriate to expect. Same is true when we think about the context of a kid in an environment. I tend to think whenever I think about this, because look, sometimes kids need discipline. Sometimes they make bad choices and they need to be held to the logical consequences of that. Whenever I think of a behavior, I always think the first thing I want to know is, can I think of a scenario where this behavior makes a lot of sense? And then I want to rule out that that's the thing, right? Like, is this just an adaptive thing that would make a ton of sense if I were experiencing that? And if it is, then I have a different problem to solve than immediately going to the kid. And what's nice about that is it doesn't excuse it because I can go find out whether that's actually the problem. But we never start with compassion, right? Normally, we start with blame. We start with it's just immediately, and we have a bias toward this sort of naturalism that it's the kid. It's the kid that's the problem. Notice how we never start with the environment's the problem.
The cockpit story, you tell how like they first blamed the pilot and then they blamed the flight instructors and they never blamed the cockpit. And I think it's so important to realize that because when we're doing to kids in schools, when they are maybe cheating or if they're not applying themselves or something like that, it's like, wow, that kid must have some sort of moral defect. They're dishonest, they're lazy. When reality, the world that we've created for them, we do a whole episode on this, the world that we've created for them makes that behavior completely logical. And that's not their fault.
That's right. I think that like it's just things are more complex than that. And if you start with that compassion and you start by ruling out the funny thing is though, is people don't like the other answer because it means they have to put work in. Right. Like I'll tell you, you remember the marshmallow study? Like one of my colleagues did what I think is the best version of this because that's always interpreted as some innate attribute of self-control, and we can plot it on a kid and kids that have higher levels, and it ignores the context completely. My colleague did a version of the study, which I think should be the definitive one, where she put kids in this, they time it's like up to 15 minutes and how long you wait. Well, randomly put kids in two different groups. One, and what they did was they varied something before. Rather than do the marshmallow test first, they had them, they got crayons and they got to draw on a mug. And in one of the groups, the adult said, oh, we get to do this. And they brought in amazing crayons and they got to do it. The other group, the adult didn't keep their word. And it was accidental. They came back and said, I'm sorry, we didn't have them. Here's some of the things you can do. And then they put them into the marshmallow test. And in the environment where the adult kept their word, when you are promised more treats, if you don't eat the marshmallow, almost every kid looks like a rock star of self-control. Almost literally, most of them went the entire 15 minutes. In the group where the adult hadn't kept their word, nobody did. And so then the question is, what is self-control? Why in the world would I delay gratification on the thing I can see right here in the hopes that you will be honest with me when I have evidence that I cannot trust you? And I think, do we spend any time creating the conditions of trust in an environment where the kid can believe that what we tell them is true, that we actually have their interests in mind? And no, here we go. We're going to give you a test and we're going to assume that this is something about you. And because it correlates with some things, we start to pretend like maybe we know, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the sad part is that like the trust in the environment is something that's fully within the control of the adults in that room. But again, that means we have to do some work rather than just blaming the kid.
When we first got started, you told the story about you first finding out what the honors program was like. And in that description, I just heard you say, like, this is how we treat kids when we trust them. If you're an honors kid, if that's a label that you have, if you've, played the game well enough to get adults to trust you, we treat you this way. And for the rest of you that we don't trust, this is how we're going to treat you. And that becomes a self-fulfilling, you become an honors kid and you become a not honors kid, right?
It is so self-fulfilling. It's unbelievable. And like, if you think about it, learning is almost entirely about motivation and relevance. And like, boy, when a kid cares and knows why they care, it's pretty remarkable what they'll push through and what they'll do. And it's like, yeah, you can try to guess what will be relevant all the time, or you can help them acquire that genuine self-determination and have an environment for which their wishes and interests and things actually matter, right? And a kid that is self-determined has constant relevance. Like they do, they can generate that. And so it's such a funny thing because it's like, I appreciate the education system we've had. I know why we had it that way. I would have advocated for it at the time. But I know of no other institution that is so far behind the science, the insights, the things we actually know. It is the equivalent in my mind is medicine was still teaching the four humors or letting people's blood and using leeches. It's like we thought that was good at the time. We know it's not, and we know a lot more. We have made so much progress in understanding the environments that foster not only learning, we also know that we can accomplish more than academic mastery in these environments, and that kids need more than that simply to be prepared for our modern society, right? So it's funny that we spend most of our time in the incumbent system getting them to grade level, not even that, frankly, on a bunch of stuff, and we ignore everything else that matters. And meanwhile, you go to these other places that commit to mastery learning, because here's the thing, it's not just mastery learning and then we're done. It is like, it is so much more efficient, so much more effective that it frees up time to do the things that we actually want. Like, who are you? What are your passions? How do we teach you how to convert that into a productive contribution? Like the stuff that you actually want, right? So yeah, anyway, I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, but.
Yeah, and you had said that a lot of adults don't want to admit that it's an environment or that they are the ones that have to change. But why is that? And you said this earlier too, is they didn't get it as a child. And so, but what a gift for us to recognize, wow, we can change the trajectory for these kids and give them such a gift that we didn't get as kids, because when we know better, we do better.
And think about this, like we're entering a world where our technologies have moved ahead of things so fast. AI, all this stuff. It could be better, but it's going to be bumpy for a while. And throughout history, every time a new transformative technology emerges, there's upside and downside. And it is always that it requires some new skill or mindset to get the upside of the technology. And until you figure out what it is and get it to people, it's almost pure downside. For example, all the way back to the shift from spoken word to written word. It's pretty obvious that it should be better if we can write stuff down, right? If you trusted Socrates, he hated it, right? He thought we're going to lose our memory, which, kind of, but you can see the upside. What didn't dawn on people was that to get that upside, you had to learn this completely artificial skill called literacy. You actually had that taught. It's not natural. Not like language that you just pick up. You have to be taught. And the elites hoarded that skill for arguably until the Reformation. It took an act of God to democratize access. And then finally, we unleashed the full potential of literacy in terms of the written word, right? And its ability to spread. I will wager right now, which is always a dangerous thing about predicting the future, but when you think about the technologies that we face, we are facing technologies for the first time that are trying to convince you that they are human. They are trying to be human. We've never had that before. I believe that the single most important skill that a child could acquire that will be the most equivalent of literacy, that'll be so practical you can't believe in it, is this gift of self-determination. Because it's not just words, it's practice, it's habit. It's a complete orientation to how I deal with uncertainty, how I set goals, my ability to thrive in the world. And I don't know how you survive in a world where our technologies are human in a way. They do almost everything except for the last edge of what it means to be a human being. If I am still trapped in the mindset of the age of standardization, where I have been taught to be a cog, I've been taught that some other paternalists are the ones that make decisions for me, it might be the worst thing you could ever do to a kid. You are so thoroughly unprepared for the world. And so this gift of self-determination is not a luxury. It's an absolute necessity. And the people that have to hear that and know that right now are parents. That when you get nervous that your kid is doing things different than how it was done, that should be the best sign that you've ever seen, because how it was done is an intellectual death sentence for your kid. They are so thoroughly unprepared for the world. If all you want is, I can't risk my kid being unprepared, right? We don't have the resources. We don't have the social resource. They need to have the best shot at life. This is their best shot at life. It's not luxury. It is necessity.
Wow. Well, on that note, we are going to wrap up. And this is a question that I fully agree. Kaity and I are both on the same exact page as you. And like you said, you are definitely preaching to the choir. And we're so thankful for all the work that you're doing with Populace, and just love this research. So, okay, let's catch up and let's figure how to actually implement these things in schools. So we are in the same fight as you. So we ask this question to all of our guests. Who is someone who has kindled your love of learning, curiosity, motivation, or passion?
This is going to be the most wonky answer. It's the only philosopher I ever care about, which is Karl Popper. And the reason being is he changed how I thought about being a scientist. Because I think, and I actually think the way we teach science to kids is a disaster. We teach science as fact. Science is not fact. Science is provisional knowledge that is the best explanation we have right now. And Karl Popper he answered the question, which was funny, but it puzzled people for a long time, is what's the difference between science and non-science? And people say, well, it's data. Well, no, astrology uses the exact same data as astronomy. So it can't be data, right? And he said, what makes it science is that it's falsifiable, and that your job is to try to falsify theories, not prove them. And he came up with the idea that, if I had a theory that all sheep were white, I can keep seeing white sheep until I'm blue in the face. It doesn't prove it, right? It makes me a little more confident, but one black sheep, and I know that the theory is false. And so he came up with this brilliant insight, which is you get to truth through the elimination of error. You don't have to know what the truth is when you start. You just eliminate error. And so there's a humility and a power to science that I don't think we actually impart on people, right? We want them to swallow it as if it's just fact, and it's not. And as soon as you believe that it is that, progress stops. So it taught me not to just take at face value, just because you're famous, still got to have evidence, right? And the idea that we're constantly challenging things and that's progress was music to my ears. So it changed how I operate as a scientist, how I think about the world.
I love that. That's so powerful. Thank you for sharing everything you've shared with us today. I've learned so much. How can listeners learn more about your work?
You can just go to populace.org, and we publish all of our research on private opinion there. Or if, just toddrose.com if you want to see some of my commercial books and stuff like that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure to get to know you and to learn from you today. Thanks so much for coming on the KindlED Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Todd. That's it for today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the KindlED Podcast. If this episode was helpful to you, please like, subscribe, and follow us on social at PrendaLearn. If you have a question that you would like to ask, all you have to do is email us at podcast@prenda.com. You can also join our Facebook group, which is called the KindlED Collective, and we have a weekly newsletter called the Sunday Spark.
The KindlED Podcast is brought to you by Prenda. Prenda makes it easy for you to start and run an amazing microschool based on all the things that we talk about here on the KindlED Podcast. If you want more information about guiding a Prenda microschool, go to prenda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep kindling.